honorable ministers and local officials, fellow dancers and seekers, companions in the struggle, we're at an inflection point. The Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, are the planet's homework, and our exam is coming in 2030, our accountability moment. To meet those very ambitious goals, we need to change the way that we do business. Now, I'm not a water expert. The theme of my conversation with you today is what we, working in WASH, can learn from education. Not in the sense of how the education and water sectors intersect. You know more about that than I do. But rather, how those of us who are not government officials, those of us who come from the outside, can help those who have the long-haul mandate, local and national government, serve the populations that we both exist to serve. I'll get to education a little bit later. I think it's first important to unpack where we are as a development community, how we work, and how the Hilton Foundation thinks about systems. If we begin with the end in mind, think about 2030, just about delivering on one target of one goal, 6.1 on safe and sustainable drinking water. We've got a tall order. Hundreds of millions of people to benefit, hundreds of thousands of local authorities and providers to strengthen and support, and depending on the clarity and the execution of national policies in dozens of countries. It's not just a project thing. Many of us still, though, continue to staff and measure based on project-focused funding models, and we default to product distribution and to service delivery instead of working toward the much higher leverage in the change of systems. In short, we aren't yet built for the future, and the financial incentives for us to do so are not strong, yet. At the same time, as you know, the golden era of foreign aid is somewhat in our rearview mirror. Bilateral, multilateral funding is flatlining and uncertain in the future. In some cases, philanthropic funding is growing, but it's a drop on the bucket compared to the $3 to $4 trillion a year needed to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. So for many, this is an existential moment, but it's also a moment for great leadership. I'd argue that today is the day to begin to change how we work. It won't be easy. It calls for a culture shift. It will be harder to measure than, at least the measurement will be less elegant than a life saved or X number of services provided. And it calls from us to learn from different areas outside water. But I'd argue that realigning the way we operate, how we staff, and by changing our organizational culture, we'll be far better positioned to meet our global goals and move towards sustainable programming, especially for those in the most vulnerable settings. In a nutshell, it's about the how and the who, and not just the what. Today, at the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, our work follows principles and not a particular rigid mode. And as a private funder, we know that we can do things that involve more risk than government funders are often willing to undertake. Our most significant impact is investing in early-stage approaches to prove a model that can later attract larger funding streams and provide evidence for policymakers to achieve their agendas. Nowhere are we forwarding this agenda more than in our safe water work. And I would salute my colleagues, Chris and Andrea, who are here for their leadership in that. And our approach has 4 levels. Four principles. First, we start at the district level because national governments have delegated responsibility for water service delivery there. This is where we pilot, we learn, we iterate, and we adapt. We fund IRC to act as the hub and to focus on the process of partnership, ensuring it's multidisciplinary, it's public and private facing, and it's focused on the root issues that people face in getting reliable access to safe and affordable water. We look at the entire ecosystem beyond a specific intervention or a single function because we know that we need a revolution of thought when it comes to systems that move from short-term fixes to long-term solutions. We do this in our grant making by asking 3 questions. What resources are needed? What funding? What people? What skills? What cultural resources to ensure sustainable water services for everyone, in particular for people living in vulnerable and disadvantaged communities? 2, what information is needed? By whom? At what time? And conveyed through what channels? to inform decisions, to ensure sustainable water services for everyone. And 3, who's accountable for what? This is a big one. How do actors in a service delivery system hold themselves and others accountable and responsible for assuring sustainable water services? What are the motivations and the incentives? And these may, of course, be personal and professional. And the 4th principle, we embed learning and sharing at every stage. This is a challenge for us and for the entire sector. How do we effectively gather the right data at the right time and share it with the right people and institutions? So at this point, I'd like to take a slight detour into my own earlier experiences of education. And I want to make a kind of a frank assessment of the pluses and minuses of an earlier, less integrated way of working. I'm thinking of it as my confessions of a development cowboy sort of speech. It's a dated story, it's from the 1990s, but I think it's still relevant to today. Looking back to the younger me, I started with Save the Children in Mali in 1991 as the deputy director of the field office. We worked in an area called Kolonjeba, a cercle in the southern region of Mali, about half the size of, let me think, well, of Western Holland, say. 125,000 people, no paved roads, no electricity, no piped water anywhere. And for education, 225 villages, but only 12 of them had schools. And if you can think back before the SDGs, back before the MDGs, in education, we had the Education for All movement. Virtually every country in the world signed up in 1990 to get all of its children into school. Mali signed that declaration with enthusiasm. Save the Children applauded it, and neither the Malian government nor Save the Children had the vaguest idea of how it was going to be accomplished, nor indeed whether they were actually accountable for it being accomplished. Starting with Save the Children, we were not up to snuff. We were building 1 school a year in this area. And at that rate, it would have taken us 2 centuries to have a school in every village. And often, the schools were more occupied by goats than by students, because there was all the teacher supply question that went with that. On the government side, the Ministry of Education also not focused on delivery. 25% of the national budget spent on education, getting 20% of the primary school-age population into school. 10,000 villages, 8,000 had no schools. 25 high schools in the whole country, no university. And in the rural areas, it was acute. If you were a girl living in a village with no school, the chances were 1 in 20 that you would go to primary school. And the culprit in this was a mental model of a hub-and-spoke school system where one village supplied 8 to 10 other villages with education. It didn't work. The cowboy model of development, the interventionist model of development was, as Nike says, just do it. We, in our NGO, sat down and said, how in our area could we change this? Could we make this work? Could we get every child into school? And we saw our primary accountability as to communities, to parents, and to students. We talked for 4 months with communities about what the drivers of demand for them were, and we found that demand was actually high, the latent demand, but not for the model that was on offer. What villages wanted was a school in every village, and that's what we set out to design. We thought long and hard on that, discussed it a lot with people in communities, and came up with a model that would lower the costs, the infrastructure costs and the salary costs of schools by 90%, bringing it to a level that communities could afford to finance themselves. We mandated gender parity, 1 girl for every boy enrolled. And since the school was in the communities went with that. The schools were designed to be locally financed and sustainable. The community planted an extra hectare of cotton and financed all the operating costs and the teacher fees out of that harvest. The system took off. 1992, we had 4 schools. 1999, there were 800, increasing the number of primary schools in Mali by 40%. There were 9 girls for every 10 boys in the school system. And they were self-financing even as the national school system was beset by financial woes and strikes. Without wishing it, Save the Children became the shadow ministry of education in the southern region of Mali. at least for primary education. And we had some linkages with the Ministry of Education, particularly those who design curricula, but we had much stronger relationships with communities. And that was, in fact, our undoing. Despite success on the ground, we had no political traction in Bamako and opposition of educated public opinion, journalists, and parliament. And when it came to a question of education reform discussion, even though the delivery model was proven on the ground, it had no traction in those debates. So looking at the strengths versus the weaknesses of that effort, the strengths were considerable. This effort met needs where there were no government short-term or long-term plan or medium-term plans to provide schooling. It was very strong on community participation and demonstrated that there was demand where government had not believed that it existed. They were designed for gender parity and financial sustainability, which both of those helped the marginalized attend. Competed on quality in the early years, at least when local language was the medium of instruction. But when things got into French and required a higher level of education for teachers, our system foundered. And I think that's a very important point, that as systems become more complex, as you're looking at higher order delivery, working on your own becomes quite limited. The weaknesses of this effort. First, as I've said, low integration into the wider system. And that meant that children graduating from these schools had a hard time accessing middle school or high school. There was skepticism and opposition in levels of the ministry. Even though the minister himself was in favor of the effort, others, his advisors, called it an opportunistic infection and did not look at it as part of their own efforts to expand educational opportunity. And again, we function well enough at those lower order levels where community effort can deliver a product. But where we got to more specialized levels of education, middle, secondary school, community-based efforts are not strong enough. I think you'll see an analog in the WASH sector about the well and the borehole versus the piped water on premises. Some more complex tasks require all hands on deck. Now, so how does this all apply to water? Well, first, the conceptual points. I won't point fingers at anyone but myself in the room, but it is very tempting to be a cowboy. It's very tempting to take on responsibility for things you know you can deliver. And in a lot of ways, our incentive systems are designed for us to operate in this way and focus on short-term, tangible deliverables. And even the SDGs can push us in this direction. There are many valuable things that exogenous actors like ourselves can bring. We bring fresh ideas, fresh willingness to listen and understand, flexible resources that aren't already committed, and the ability to attract new actors or to help old actors take on new roles. But there are also limitations to external actors. First, we lack a mandate. It was a great act of hubris to intervene in the way that Save the Children did. We also lack a long-haul mentality, a long-haul mental orientation. Say, an international NGO, 15 years in one place is long. 20 is almost unheard of. And yet that's how long a lot of this development takes. Again, limits to the complexity of what we can manage and limited resources compared to the whole financing need. And now, about practical ways of working in the WASH sector. In the district of Asutifi-North in Ghana, we're exploring how to create a systems approach in a way that's both flexible enough to share and scale, and specific enough to address the unique challenges found in every community and in every country. Our partners, including IRC, CDC, Safe Water Network, World Vision, the Acquia Institute, net-centric campaigns, local stakeholders from government, service providers, traditional leaders, and members of civil society. I feel like I'm thanking people for an Academy Award, but undertook a process to identify a shared vision of success and root causes of failure. The result was a joint master plan, and as Patrick said yesterday, I think as importantly, a master vision that lays out the aspirations and targets for water for everyone, for households, public and private health facilities, schools, and multiple sector-owned and championed by the district assembly government. This is a better way to work. And this is the pilot for full WASH coverage. And here are a few things we've learned so far. First, there was an interesting assumption that the mining in the district was contaminating the water. Yet samples showed that only traces of E. coli were there. And they weren't a result of the mining. Service providers hadn't fully understood what to test for, exposing a critical knowledge and accountability gap that impacted all actors: government, service providers, and customers. But you'll hear more about what we're learning from my colleagues Chris and Andrea throughout this conference. So where does this leave us? 4 important takeaways. First, the questions you ask first are very important. And again, the questions we were asking at the beginning of this: what resources are needed, what information is needed, who's accountable for what, and is it adequately incentivized? And let me just go back to that education example for this, because I think the points are important. What resources are needed? What the work in education showed is that there were resources that were right there in front of everyone's face and that weren't deployed. There was community ability to finance, there was community ability to actually teach. There are similar resources that are available at many levels in WASH, and our job is to help find them and how they can be optimally used. What information is required? This is not just data getting back and forth from one user to another. It's also what ideas and mental frames people are using. And again, in Mali, in education, it was a school in every village. Yesterday, what I heard from the minister in Ghana is it's piped water on premises. That is the moonshot. That is the idea that is driving. Who's accountable for what? How is it adequately incentivized? We have the opportunity to help players, actors, reorder accountabilities in more constructive ways. A second takeaway is diagnose first. From this analysis, we're better able to invest in the solutions and interventions that address root causes. With insight, we can more effectively advocate with sound data to improve decision-making. A third takeaway should be bottom-up and top-down. Here's a mea culpa from my earlier days, where we were resolutely bottom-up and got as far as we could with it. But iterating between the two, and bottom is community, middle is local government, top is national policy, we can come out much, much further. Fourth takeaway, create a virtuous cycle. Learn, share, iterate, and adapt. This is about data and decision-making. This is about progress toward the goals. We've got 4,312 days to go to achieve SDG target 6.1. Our only real chance to meet our ambitious goal is to change the way we work, to think big, to learn, to stretch, to solve, and to share. I invite you to join us on the journey. Thank you very much.